the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happy through Christ our Lord. Amen. Virgin most powerful, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so this conference is on fortitude, and we have to make distinctions among fortitude. St. Thomas says there are three ways that fortitude can actually be looked at. The first is taking in the strict or narrow sense, which is what we tend to associate with the word courage, which is the ability to engage the arduous. So the general definition is the willingness to engage the arduous, and the arduous is that which is difficult in order to obtain the end. So he says that this the strict sense is ultimately about the person who's willing to go to battle and die in battle. So that's the stricter sense of the virtue of fortitude. But then he says there's a broader sense of fortitude, and that has to do with anything that is arduous or difficult to achieve. And so and that willingness to engage in that, and that can pertain to just about anything. And then he says, sometimes fortitude is just taken as virtue in general, because virtue helps us to engage things that are difficult. But generally, you tend to see the authors use it, they'll mention the stricter sense, but then they'll say it's in the broader sense. The fortitude, of course, there's two kinds of virtues. There's the natural virtue of fortitude. So its natural object is the arduous, but here we're talking about things that are physically arduous or just mentally arduous, what have you, but it's something that's on a purely natural level. Then there's the supernatural virtue, which ultimately has as its object God, and those things which help to achieve God. So it's engaging things that are very difficult. In fact, the spiritual life itself is very arduous, just generally even when you get a grace, it usually is more difficult, although when you become more proficient, it's a little bit easier. One of the sub-virtues one of the sub-acts, I should say, to the supernatural virtue of fortitude is martyrdom. And the church formally teaches that in order to engage in this particular act of the supernatural virtue of fortitude requires a specific grace, not an ordinary grace. It's a specific grace that God has to give you in order for you to be able to attain that in order to sustain death, ultimately, for the sake of God. Okay, so that's kind of the general outline of it. Of course, it is, because it deals with the arduous, which is things that are difficult, it resides in the irascible appetite. So it's the virtue and the irascible appetite by which one is willing to engage the arduous. That's an important point, because that means that we actually have to develop our irascible appetite. That's the appetite that has the ability to engage in things like anger, daring, things of this sort, which we'll talk about in a little bit in a minute. But it's that appetite that inclines me to achieve it. St. Thomas says that the concupiscible appetite, which we'll see later, it's temperance that resides in it. But the concupiscible appetite desires the good in general. But here he's talking about bodily goods. And so the result of that is this good in general is that we just have inclinations to food, to conjugal relations. We can develop the concupiscible appetite to actually desire things that it's not naturally inclined towards, like wanting to own a particular automobile or a house or things of this sort. So, because the house, strictly speaking, doesn't fulfill one of my faculties. So it doesn't fulfill the concupiscible appetite. But we can train the concupiscible appetite to desire these things. This is also one of the reasons why when you make bad choices, you can train the concupiscible appetite to desire things that are disordered or contrary to reason. So people can actually create these desires for things that are, like hurting or maiming people. People can actually have develop that desire for it. Okay. So the good, then what happens is the intellect perceives that there's this good that I want to pursue. So there's a stake. sitting on the counter that's been cooked and it looks perfect, right? However, Jeff is standing in front of the steak, fending me off to keep me from the steak. So Jeff is the arduous good that's keeping me from getting the steak. So St. Thomas says the concupiscible appetite desires the thing, and if it doesn't immediately have it, or in achieving it is going to be difficult, that's when the irascible appetite arises in order to pursue the object. So the irascible appetite deals with means, attaining the end. Once you get the thing that your irascible appetite is fighting for, then it finally rests in delight. So I fake Jeff out, get him to go chase after something else, and then I eat his steak. Okay, so this is the general structure about how this works. So the irascible appetite is always about the means. The concupiscible appetite is always about ends. And so this is one of the reasons why the pursuit of the arduous is meant as a temporary state of affairs. It's not, so once we get to heaven, things will be easy. Okay. So this is kind of the general structure. What moves the irascible appetite is something in the concupiscible appetite to achieve it. But then once it achieves it, then the irascible appetite ceases. We know this ourselves. Part of the irascible appetite is getting angry. So when we get angry, once we get the vindication, which is the arduous part to achieve, once we get that vindication, then we're satisfied and delighted in the fact that this person got their comeuppance, right? So, and so we take delight in this person getting their comeuppance, and so as a result of that, we're not angry anymore. So, okay. The virtue of fortitude. So it's a virtue which I think by and large is undeveloped in our culture. People do not engage things that are arduous in the true sense, like virtue, or even hard work. Just doing basic hard physical manual labor, most people just simply won't engage in it. They would prefer just to hire it out or have someone else do it, or think it's beneath them or what have you. Fortitude is a cardinal virtue, so it's a broad virtue, but it's broken down into 6 sub-virtues. Okay. And these are virtues in which you can have fortitude without having one of these. These are not integral parts, to remember that distinction. An integral virtue is, like with prudence, if you don't have the virtue of memory, you're simply never going to be prudent. So those 8 sub-virtues to prudence, you have to have all of those in order to be prudent. Whereas these are ones that you can have. These are just subjective parts, which just means they're parts of the virtue that once you can have fortitude without having one of these perfectly developed. And the first one is magnanimity. Okay, so magnanimity is the virtue. It comes from the words, those of you who are Latinists, magnus facere, which means to do great thing, to do something great. Magnanimity is the virtue in which one seeks excellence. Most people today, because of the fact that they, and this is something that's very key, most people today, so not that I want to beat up on the millennials all of the time, but the thing with the millennials is that everything has been given to them. There was no requirement to engage in anything that was arduous. As a result of that, they actually have sloth, which is once something arduous comes up, they immediately turn from it, and they don't want to pursue it, or they think someone else should simply provide it without themselves having to do it. So as a result of that, because they've never had to really engage in things that are hard and difficult, the resulting is they've entered into this state where they're all, I don't know if you've noticed this, but a vast majority of them, in fact, it's a rarity to find one that has any sense of magnanimity, achieving greatness or excellence. That's completely lacking from their generation. In fact, it's all mediocrity. And they're satisfied in their mediocrity as long as they're comfortable. They don't even care to make a decent, they don't care to make a lot of money or to better their state in life. They don't really care as long as their very basic needs are met. They don't care. And this is one of the signs that the parents didn't require them to engage in things that were arduous and difficult. So they didn't develop the virtue of fortitude. And part of that is they didn't develop the virtue of magnanimity. Now, St. Thomas says, so it's the virtue that seeks excellence in all things, but especially great things. So the person who's magnanimous is the person who actually will engage in something that's more difficult than, say, the average person's willing to engage in. And so you see this. So people who study certain disciplines academically, like, so for example, somebody who ends up studying psychology, even though I've written in psychology and I've studied myself, usually people who study psychology, they study it because they don't have enough brains or enough energy or enough drive to study, say, medicine or something else. So you tend to find that the students in that academic discipline, generally speaking, are fairly mediocre students, generally speaking. Although I'm sure I'll get blowback from people saying, oh, that's not true, there's all these geniuses. Yeah. But the point being is that they don't strive for things that are great. And this is something which it needs to be instilled by parents, is achieving that greatness through the consistent, engaging things that are arduous or difficult. So that magnanimity, achieving great things. People today don't want to be great people anymore. They just want a comfortable life, which is a sign that our culture is in decline. The next is magnificence. So magnificence comes, magnanimity, take the Fortitude out. Magnanimity comes from magnus and animus. So greatness of soul, Oh, back up. So this greatness of soul, St. Thomas says, actually, if you look at magnanimity, it's actually identical with virtue. So the magnanimous man is the guy who constantly tries to perfect and reach a high level of virtue in each of the areas. And so this is one of the reasons why once in a while spiritual directees say, well, Father, I think I'm going to give up candy for Lent. No, you're not. You're going to give up meat for Lent. Something that's hard and difficult. Because people are always kind of looking for that middle road. Well, they kind of comply. They kind of build a little bit of virtue, but not a great amount of virtue. Okay. So it's actually from greatness of soul, whereas magnificence is from magnus facere, which means to do great things. So it's the person who, St. Thomas says, specifically uses their financial means in order to achieve great things. And so this is something which obviously not everybody can develop. St. Thomas says that, the poor man can't develop the virtue of magnificence because he doesn't have any money. So he can't really use his money to create these great things. So what would be an example of creating these great things? Help building a monastery. Giving a large sum of money so that a monastery can be built, or a monument, or something of this sort. Or using your monies to help get a society off the ground, which we've talked a little bit about. But you can use your money to do things that will actually help quite a bit, or to build great churches, right? One of the signs that we have a problem in the church today is that even when they're building churches, there's no sense of magnificence anymore. Although it's starting to re-arise. You're starting to see some guys build churches that are starting to look pretty good and pretty decent. But the real problem today, people, is they'll look at it and they say, well, we just want to spend $2 million building this church. This will be adequate for our needs, and we'll be able to raise the money in a couple of years and have it done and over with. Rather than in the past, so for example, if you look at the church, Sacred Heart, in Newark, New Jersey, it's probably the most Gothic church in the United States, even more so than St. Patrick's. It took 80 years to build that church. So the point being is that there was a recognition of, no, we're gonna take our time to build something great rather than just making our situation comfortable and easy for the short term. Okay. So this magnificence, so a poor person can't develop it, but its opposite, of course, is going to be stinginess. Actually, the technical term is parvificence, where the person does little things with their money. They're more concerned about holding on to their capital or their money than they actually are doing great things with their money. Now, that doesn't mean you impoverish yourself in the process of doing the great things, but it does mean you have to be willing to be separated from your money to some degree in order to do great things. Okay. The next is patience. Now, everybody gets patience wrong. They'll be sitting at the stoplight and they'll say, I'm just impatient. I'm waiting for this stoplight to turn green. Actually, that's not what patience is. That's waiting the good. Waiting to do a green light is always a good thing, right? So whereas patience deals with the ability to suffer evils with equanimity. So that when evil things happen to us, we don't get upset by it. It doesn't faze us. We just recognize it. Okay, God wants me to suffer now, right? And the patience is the ability to suffer it well, so that you can go a long time, which is different from perseverance. But it's the ability to suffer well. And most people don't have that ability, because it comes from the Latin word patire, which means to suffer. So it's the ability to suffer well when those things actually happen to us. So people who get angry or they get tore up, there's a lack of patience there, that ability to suffer well. But it also means equanimity in the face of evil things. What does that mean? It means that your interior peace and focus of your lower faculties, especially the irascible appetite. So when you come up against this evil, the irascible appetite doesn't get all worked up in trying to want to go after it or deal with it or to crush it or whatever the case is. Instead, when it comes up, it remains completely peaceful and has this equanimity, which means equalness of soul. That's what that word means. It has that equalness of soul in relationship to it. It doesn't disturb you. It doesn't mean you don't care. It just means that when you see the evil, you're not tore up about it, right? I think this is actually true in relationship to the magisterium right now. People are complaining a lot about certain members of the magisterium, and a lot of it's because they just don't suffer well in relationship to the members of the magisterium when they're not doing what's necessary. So it's that equanimity in the face of evils. This is an important point to keep in mind, because this basically means that when you start suffering an evil, you have to remember that God is the Lord of history. He has absolute control over every iota of every circumstance of every individual in the world. So because he has control of that, you have to recognize that when God puts you, like when you're driving down and all of a sudden you're going through a series of lights and you're hitting every single red light, which is pretty common in certain places. So you're hitting every single red light. What does that mean from God? Well, that means that God wants you to suffer those things and develop that virtue at that moment. And then point in fact, your loss of time is what God is asking you to be willing to separate from in order for you to, or getting to your destination quickly, that detachment from that in order to develop this virtue. So that's what he's asking for you in that moment. And that's always something to kind of keep in mind. The next is perseverance. This is the virtue by which one persists in the arduous good until the end is achieved. In other words, it's the person who can keep doing it until he finally gets there, right? And so one of the ways that we get derailed from perseverance is the original problem of original sin of wanting our comfort. So a lot of times, once it becomes a little bit arduous and it's going to take a little bit of time, people will just give up and then just do what they, just give up on the thing, not pursue it anymore, and seek a life of mediocrity, as I mentioned before. But the perseverance is that ability to stick to it. Now, obviously, these virtues are governed by prudence, which we'll see a little bit later. There's a vice opposite of this by excess. So that lack of, that unwillingness to engage it at all, perseverance for a long period of time, is effeminacy. Whereas when we go to extremes, where we just hold on to the thing even irrationally, then it's pertinacity, the vice of pertinacity, which we'll see a little bit here. Okay, so perseverance is the virtue by which one persists in the arduous. This is one of the reasons why parents have to set goals for their children to achieve, and then once they achieve it, there should be some kind of a reward for it, so that the child learns that the good is something that you have to work towards in order to achieve. The next is longanimity, comes from the Latin words longus and animus, which means longness of soul. So this longness of soul basically means the ability to await the good. So when you're sitting at the stoplight, right, when you're sitting at the stoplight and it's going on extraordinarily long, and there's nobody moving, of course, then what happens is the irascible appetite arises because it wants to attain the object quicker than it's coming. Whereas the longness of soul is the ability to await the good. Whereas patience is the ability to suffer evils. Okay, so patience is I can suffer this evil for as long as is necessary, and suffer it well. And then longanimity is the ability to await the good. I can hold out for this. I can wait. I don't have to have it right now. This is actually one of the signs of this, in our culture that people do not have this virtue. Is like, for example, when my parents grew up, there were no credit cards. And credit was hard to come by. So when you first got married, you had to live in a lesser state of conditions when you first got married, and everybody understood that, and you had to work your way through it, and you had to wait the good to achieve these particular things that people have when they're in their 40s and 50s and 60s, etc. But today, the kids want to go from a certain standard of living to immediately laterally moving into that standard of living, and so by the time they're done, they're up to their eyeballs in debt. Because credit comes too easy, they've racked up their credit cards. I read an article, and I don't know how accurate it is, but it said that the average credit card debt in this country, this was 2 years ago, was $80,000. That's the average credit card debt in this country, which I imagine most of it has been refinanced for these people. But this is the problem that we're dealing with. Why? Because kids want something, they immediately go get it. There's no sense of, no, I got to work towards it and not be in debt. There's also, because they've never had to pay the price for being in debt, then as a result of that, and there's also no sense of obligation today to actually pay off the debt. As a result of that, people are willing to rack up the debt because they think it's just an easy, quick way to get what they want, and they don't have to worry about it. So they literally live paycheck to paycheck, but they have every little thing that they want, which is a problem. And I think that that's one of the signs that, that parents have to teach their children, look, debt is a bad thing. When I grew up, you only went into debt when it was absolutely necessary. Or unless that the benefits of it were going to greatly outweigh the possibility of being in debt. That's the only time that you ever did it. So, and whereas today, everybody just immediately gets into debt for every little thing that they want, rather than only spending the money that they actually have at the moment or that they have from their current paycheck. Okay. But this longanimity, that ability to wait the good, is something that is important. This is something that you see a lot of times in the spiritual life. People get frustrated that, how come I'm not in mystical contemplation already? Well, first of all, it's because you have all these vices. Second of all, it's because of the fact that God wants you to await the good for a while. This longanimity is developed in purgatory. In relationship to those who don't have any imperfections in this life when they die, but they haven't reached a level of perfection where they don't have to spend any time in purgatory, the saints talk about how the fact that they have to sit in purgatory. They have to just sit there. They're not suffering except for they're being separated from God. So they have to await the good. And that has to do with developing this virtue. The next virtue is mortification. It comes from the Latin words mors facere, which means to make dead. Okay. And this mortification is the virtue by which you are willing to suffer. Willing to suffer. So, as you know, as one of the effects of original sin, let's back up just a little bit. So when Eve ate the fruit, one of the things that happened was she looked at the fruit, and Satan had put in her mind that this was a good that God was keeping from her. As a result of that, she consented to the sin of indignation. There was no reason she should be indignant that God kept anything from her. He doesn't owe her anything, right? So what happens is she becomes indignant, and then she desires this thing that's good, and so she's unwilling. There's 2 times she's unwilling to suffer. The first is unwilling to suffer the possible loss of a higher state by eating the fruit. The second is, by some people's speculation, she was unwilling to suffer the separation from Adam, and that's why she tried to control him. Okay. So the point being is that there has to be that willingness to suffer. As a result of that, we ended up with this inclination to have a horror or a fear of suffering. It's in the lower faculties. It's primarily in the concupiscible appetite, really. It turns away from it, but also in the irascible appetite, where fear is. But it tends to turn away from suffering because we don't want to have to go through the pain of something. In order to attain in order to attain the virtue of mortification, this is where reason and will have to be very strong and maintain the course despite the fact that the appetites don't want it. And then over the course of time, the appetites will actually see the good that they're attaining through the virtue, engaging the things that are painful and difficult. And as a result of that, there's a willingness, even on the side of the faculty, to engage in that particular virtue, okay, or that arduous thing. Okay. Now, fortitude regulates a few things. The first, and these are the vices contrary to fortitude. The first is the vice of fear. This is the vice in which one has an unmoderated passion arising from the perception of future evil. The person doesn't control their fear. See, today in modern psychology, they just say, well, if you try and control your emotions, you're going to end up with frustration and repression, and you end up a mess. Well, quite frankly, if you don't control your emotions, you're going to end up a mess. Which we're seeing in our culture, right? Most people, I think, and this is my own estimation, I think most people in the American culture are mentally ill right now because they've elevated their emotions above reason and they literally don't follow reason. But that being said, the fear, so fortitude regulates or moderates the fear so that the fear is only proportionate to the thing and by degree, so that you're only afraid of it and it's by a certain degree. Now this becomes very important because the truly courageous man doesn't have fear. And why is that? It has to do with the fact that truly courageous man, now people can do an act that on the externals looks like it's courageous, but if the fear isn't moderated, the virtue isn't in the faculty, and as a result of that, you don't say they have fortitude or courage. So when they're engaged in this, whereas the man who has engaged the evil thing or suffered a lot through that thing, the fear is moderated so that when he comes up against a future evil which he can overcome, then there's no fear, even if it means he's going to take a bit of a beating, right? There's no fear. Whereas if it's a type of fear that, yeah, you know, we stand to take a shellacking here, and, you know, most of our troops are going to get wiped out, then the fear has to be moderated and proportionate to that. Whereas if the fear is out of control, then the person doesn't have any courage at all. This also means that the person actually has to engage the arduous to develop fortitude. This is why a guy who goes through basic training you don't say is courageous. It's only the guy who's been in battle, faced death, conquered his fear in relationship to it that you actually say is courageous. And it's not the guy who simply goes into the battle because he doesn't want to go to jail, and then afterwards he comes out and he still hasn't developed any moderation of his fear in relationship to his possibility of death. That's so somebody who goes into battle but it still comes out, you know, a coward or a fearful, that is not somebody who we would say is courageous. So a coward is basically someone who's unwilling to engage what is arduous. That's what a coward is. That means that our culture is rife with cowardice right now, because people don't want to do things that are difficult. Part of the difficulty with things becoming very convenient and easy, don't get me wrong, I'm very much for advancing these things so that they become less difficult and arduous, but there still has to be a certain amount of ardor in a person's life, otherwise they are simply going to dissipate spiritually. Okay. So the vice contrary to fortitude, in addition to fear, is cowardice. So fear is one extreme. So the person is too afraid of the thing the painful thing. Whereas fearlessness is a lack of moderated fear. It's by excess. It's the person who doesn't have fear when they should have fear. So, for example, some of these guys that jump off these buildings, or not buildings, but cliffs, and then do, I don't know if you've ever seen those flight suit videos. There has to be some moderated fear because you're skirting death, right? You're very easy, those guys die all the time. You hear about them. Sometimes they do stuff that is just completely irrational. Like one video I watched, this guy actually flew. By the time he gets going, he's reached almost terminal velocity. He's doing like 120 miles an hour. He's reached that, and he decides he wants to fly the flight suit through a 12-foot hole in the cliff. You know, that's just a complete lack of rightly ordered fear, right? Because, I mean, literally just one twitch of the arm and he's a dead man, right? Okay. So it's a lack of moderated fear. Okay. So this is when the person doesn't have any fear about anything. And you see people like that from time to time. They're never afraid of anything. The next is audacity. This is excessive aggressiveness towards imminent danger without reasonable fear. So fearlessness is just kind of a general, or fear is just kind of a general thing, whereas audacity is a person is willing to race into battle without any fear whatsoever. He's willing to engage things that it could kill him without even thinking twice about it. So it's the engagement of it. It's not that you don't have any lack of fear, which is part of it. That's the fearlessness. But that you just engage it without paying attention to it. So, for example, you see this with certain guys that get in high-speed chases with the police, right? They're driving 150, 180 miles an hour down a highway, right? Well, you're just going to plow into somebody. And that audacity of being willing to do that and doing that is a sign of lack of moderation, of fear. You know, you should have some sense of fear in relationship to things that could legitimately hurt you. So fear is not an evil thing as long as it's moderated and proportionate. Okay. You also see this audacity in a broader sense where people have no fear of God, so they just don't care. But they'll do every form of sin possibly imaginable because they have no fear of God or fear of punishment or fear of hell. You also see this in relationship to even with clergy. People have in the church, one of the real difficulties that arises is that the bishops have protected the lay people when they act badly. So they know they can openly attack the clergy with impunity. They can do it and they will never have to pay for a price. So as a result of that, the audacity sometimes of the lay people today is a bit out of control, even among traditionalists. In fact, sometimes they're even the worst. Okay. The next is presumption. That's thinking that you can attain an end without aid, usually from God. In other words, I can do this. No, you can't. Whereas the presumptuous man thinks he can do it without getting any help from anybody. There's kind of a subtle form of presumption. You see this with guys who are driving around the block and they won't stop and ask for directions. Mm-hmm. Right? That's just presumption. Look, you can't do it yourself. You're going to have to stop and ask. Okay. Presumption, we usually see that the time that you hear people confess presumption the most is when they have engaged in mortal sin, knowing they're able to go to confession later. So where is the presumption in that? The presumption is that you just presume that you're going to be able to go to confession after this without God's aid, and God's aid is gratuitous. He doesn't have to give it to you. You fall into mortal sin. He's not obligated. There's all sorts, I run across them all the time in my line of work. There are all sorts of people who started engaging in mortal sin, and they would go to confession. They were in and out of confession, and eventually what ended up happening is God just pulled the plug and didn't give them a particular grace at a certain point, and their life went off in Timbuktu. Mm-hmm. So this is something that you see from time to time is presumption. Ambition. This is striving for honor above one's excellence. What does that mean? St. Thomas says we get a pleasure out of thinking about ourselves. And God created it naturally for this. And part of this was so that we could see the good of ourselves in order to preserve it as part of the categories of natural inclination, particularly the first one, preserve our being as it is. That's one of the reasons he did it. But what ends up happening is because of original sin, everything's unmoderated, so people tend to look at themselves and tend to think they are more excellent than they actually are. Right? So people always tend to think they're better than they actually are. That's the general rule. Once in a while, you get people who don't think they're as good as they are, but sometimes that can be a subtle way of thinking they actually are better. It's just that nobody recognizes it, and poor me, that nobody recognizes how good I am. But that's not always the case. So people tend to think they're better than they actually are. And as a result of that, they'll strive for things that are above their condition or state. Perfect example. When my cousin got his doctorate in biochemistry, I said to him, congratulations, that's quite an accomplishment. He says, no, it's not. He says, what do you mean? It just means that I stuck around long enough to where they got sick of me and gave me the degree. And afterwards, we talked off and on about it. We both were in agreement that I would say over half the people who go to college have no business being in college. And of the people that are in grad school, I would say 80 to 90% of them have no business being in grad school. And the people getting doctorates, maybe 1 in 25 should be getting their doctorates. But people know that the academic standards have been lessened, and so they're trying to achieve something that makes them look like they've achieved something which in the past was extraordinary and now has become ordinary. So this is a case of ambition. People are striving for stuff that they have no business doing, right? You see this a little bit among the clergy. There can be where one guy thinks he's an awesome preacher. So usually what I will do is when some guy just thinks he's the cat's meow in preaching, when he was under me, I would say, I want you to preach on this topic, which is usually something difficult. And of course they fail, or it's miserable, or the people are bored to death, and then they scratch their head, I wonder why nobody liked my homily, right? So part of that is they always say when you first become a priest, and there's a real amount of truth in this, when you're first a priest, a lot of priests coming out of the seminaries when they're first ordained think they know far more than they do. And that first year to 2 years is a major attitude adjustment because you realize I got put in all sorts of situations where people brought stuff to confession that I didn't have a clue how to answer about. Or I did the wrong thing. Let's just hope it's not grave, like invalidating sacraments, etc., which happens from time to time, too. But this is also another thing that people have ambition. So certain people want to be priests or religious or nuns. Like, I want to be a nun. Yeah, but you're not even chaste. First, you haven't even demonstrated that you have the excellence of chastity. So if you don't have that excellence, why would you enter into a state that requires that excellence? So this is something that people tend to not get. So ambition. People are too ambitious. By the way, we have to distinguish that word from the common colloquial use of the term ambition in English, which just means that the person's motivated. In fact, in our culture, the problem is the opposite. Most people are not ambitious. So, the next is inane glory. This is seeking honor in those things unworthy of honor. What do you think of my new makeup? Don't I look just beautiful with my new makeup? Why are you trying to seek honor in that, right? Or another one is, the guy's driving in the car. Look at my car, I'm driving an Aston Martin. What do you think of that? I think you should give it to me so I can drive it. No. The point is that, people tend to think that their externals or things that aren't really that significant or important are the things that they should get honor for. By honor, we know it means praise for excellence, right? And the excellence, St. Thomas says, is virtue. So a lot of times people are seeking their excellence in their external things rather than in their virtue. Okay. So you see that, this inane glory from time to time. The next is Poo Solemnity. This is smallness of soul. This is the vice or the habit of not striving for excellence. So you don't see too many magnificent people, or magnanimous people today. Most people are pusillanimous. They really, as long as their comfort's in place, as long as they have what they want, they just really don't care to better themselves or achieve anything greater. And part of that is by training. So I think a large percentage of these people are pusillanimous because their parents trained them that way. They didn't require them to engage things that were difficult to either man up or become better people or to gain certain virtues or to die to themselves, etc. The next one is parvificence. This is stinginess. Okay, this is the vice where one is unwilling to use one's wealth to do great things, which I mentioned before. So magnificence is you have to be willing to be separated from your money to some degree in order to achieve, to do great things. Whereas parvificence is the vice in which a person just wants to hoard their money and not do anything big or great with their money. They just want to hold on to it because they want the comfort and security of having the money there. And of course, Christ's response to him was, the guy who builds a tower and loads it up with grain is, he's going to lose his life tonight. So what did he gain in the process? The point being is that for those who have money, they have to be willing to use the money in order to achieve or to do great things for culture, for other people, etc. This also means that I just lost my thought. Okay, maybe I'll come back to it. The next is the Latin word molitias, which is translated as softness. Sometimes it's translated as effeminacy. And this is an unwillingness to put aside pleasure in order to engage the arduous. The person's just soft. So you'll see that, the guy's the couch potato. He just sits there and doesn't do anything to even lift his arms off the thing, and he just has to flip a button, right? Now, this softness is both physical in the sense of people have to be willing to engage things that are physically difficult to do, but then they also have to be willing to engage in things that are emotionally difficult to do. So that's why there's different kinds of effeminacy, which we've talked about in the past. One of the problems we're starting to see now is science is getting so adept that they're capable of removing the effects of vice on a physical level with many of the vices. So, for example, they're getting really good at that. So one of the things, which I don't know if you've seen, but they have this new drug they've developed where they took these mice, if I understand the study correctly, they took these mice and they got them in shape, put them on little treadmills and got them in shape. Then they started feeding them this drug and wouldn't let them get any exercise for long periods of time, like 2 to 3 weeks at a whack. And normally speaking, with us as human beings, we know this. The body, there's a principle, the body adjusts itself to the operations of the soul. So if I work out and I go jogging and I work out, I lift weights, etc., the body's going to adjust itself to accommodate that particular activity. Whereas if I'm sitting on a couch, what's it going to do? It's going to adjust itself. It's going to become soft so that it's comfortable sitting on the couch. Okay. So that's what it does, adjust itself to it. Well, now what they've done with this is now they can actually maintain the muscle to where they can, so they make the mice sit there, and then they took them back on the treadmill after like 3 weeks, put them on the treadmill, and they were able to run the same speed that they were and the same longevity they did in the past. Oh. So literally, all you have to do is get in shape, take this pill, and you can be a couch potato the rest of your life and not get physically soft. That's a problem. I suspect there's going to be some other downside to that drug, but anyway. Okay. The last one is pertinacity. This is the excessive clinging to one's assertions, opinions, or intellectual convictions. So here we're not talking about adherence to the truth, because that's a certain virtue. It's part of the virtue of veracity. But it's that willingness to truthfulness. It's that willingness to tenaciously hold to the truth. Here we're talking about areas where we're not talking about the truth here. We're talking about areas that have to do with possible observations, opinions, things of that sort. And even if you do know the truth, there's sometimes you just have to let people suffer their falsity in their mind, and you can't just force them to try and do what you know to be true. You have to propose it and just leave it alone. In other words, there's a certain detachment in relationship to it, but there's not an excessive clinging on to, holding on to their opinions. There can be all sorts of reasons for this. There can be fear of being wrong. It's painful to be wrong. And so people a lot of times won't want to do that, but that pertinacity, that holding on to it unreasonably in relationship to something is, whereas we should really, our convictions, our opinions, the degree that we should have that we should hold on to those is directly to proportion to how certain they actually are. One of the problems that that you see is science. The hallmark of science is precision in judgment, where you don't judge a thing greater or less than it is, but precisely as it is, right? So what that means is that there are certain things where we don't have that precision of judgment. We're not capable of having it because the object is either outside the range of our faculties or ability to know, or we can only know certain parts or degrees of it, and so we can't know it completely enough to have exactly precise judgment. And that means, therefore, that you have to, your hold or your assertion in relationship to something has to be proportionate only to the degree that the thing will allow in relationship to precision. So one of the problems you actually see among trads is they're just rife with opinions, and certain areas are not clear, but they will tenaciously hold to that position. And you're just like, this is part of the tradition. Well, there's other parts of the tradition too, right? Because this area was a legitimate area of debate. And so but they'll tenaciously hold on to their opinion as if it's the standard, or thinking they have greater precision than they actually, or they think they actually know it when they don't. Okay. So part of fortitude, ironically, is being able to refrain the irascible appetite's assertion in these areas beyond the degree that it should be asserted. Okay. Any questions? No. Okay. Then if you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos, sit manet semper. Amen.